I think we really need to talk about the reality of what's happened over the past week. YouTubers did everything in their power to come out downplaying the Switch 2, making up all these narratives about it and continuing this farce at that Steam Deck, PC, all these other platforms are somehow relevant or more desirable than the Switch, right? They came out like saying this like religiously. That was their thing, is that like, the Steam Deck is going to stop the Switch too. Hey genius, the Steam Deck couldn't even outperform the Switch One. It's just a completely delusional, out of touch, rambling from just like, just completely brain dead commentary channels who think that like people owning PCs magically means that they won't play Switches. Like, pro tip, guys, like, I own a PC. I don't use it for gaming because it sucks. I'm not, there are many such cases, like, it's not difficult to wrap your head around, right? That people prefer Nintendo Switch for games. And that's just like the reality of the situation, looking at like all of these narratives and all these copes, like Nintendo Switch 2 will be successful. It's already like, just topping the charts in every country where it's available. Like we talk about Japan specifically, but there are lots of other countries where it is available and it is doing well. All these people like acting as if like $450, which is only $150 more than the base Switch, by the way, $100 more than the OLED, actually. Like, you have all these people coming out and saying that that's expensive when, like, I'm sitting here looking at, like, Meta Quest 3s, which are about 500, iPads, which are about 1,000, gaming PCs, which are pre-built gaming PCs, which are about 3,000. I'm looking at, like, 3D printers, which are 800. I'm looking at like, inside bikes that are like 2,000. Like 450 isn't shit. Okay, like it's just the idea that this thing was going to fail for any reason has just completely collapsed. That's very obvious, apparent by looking at the numbers and what's going on, like how many people are like excited for Bonanza and Mario Kart and stuff like that. The idea that people might be hesitant to buy this thing because of the price is completely off base, right? To me, I think it couldn't be more obvious, and the people complaining are grifters, are YouTubers looking for views, and people who hate Nintendo, right? That's kind of my perspective at it. Looking at it is people who like desperately want Nintendo to fail for like views, basically. And like always, these people are just taking fat, massive L's, and it's only going to get worse when the console actually comes out. But I do think we really do need to come out and say, right now, that this really needs to be the last time that we take any of these online critics or analysts seriously. I'm talking game journals, I'm talking YouTubers, I'm talking bloggers, like everyone, because that's one of my things I've noticed, when this happened, is that like, I was not responding to every little thing that came out. I came home like 10, 11 hours after the Switch Direct aired. I did my reaction to it. I gave like my coverage on it, which was very, very positive. I think I talked a little bit about how like the narrative around the console was obviously fake, but like it's not something that I had to dwell on or talk about, because the reality is the fan fiction alternate reality where like this thing would like jump up to $600 because of tariffs, that this would like cause the Switch 2 to bomb, which would lead to Nintendo fans like turning against Donald Trump and turning this into the communist United States of America. like this weird fan fiction, like hentai dream of like, you know, Game Explain or like Zugi X or any of these people. Like it all just completely like fell flat before it even really did anything, right? Like it was kind of crazy, like how game journals expected people to act, you know, like releasing these statements. But like, you know, I think pretty much everyone looked at this and was just like fake news, or I'm gonna buy it anyway, or like, you know, price is kind of steep, but whatever, you know, everything's expensive now. You know, nobody like seriously looks at the price and goes like, I'm not gonna buy that. Like that's too expensive. It's just a gigantic cope. And I do think that like this is not the only time we've seen this happen in recent years. You know, like we saw a lot of people, you know, try and come out and say that like Tears of the Kingdom failed, or that Mario Wonder failed, or that Fire Emblem Engage failed, that like Bayonetta 3 failed, that like you know, people were saying that like, you know, the Switch 1 wasn't doing well for like a year, you know, after it came out, right? You know, people were, you know, Video Game Lover 58 to this day will try and convince people that ARMS failed in spite of the fact it's getting a confirmed update in Switch 2. You know, like these people have been like throwing themselves at every Nintendo franchise possible, trying to diminish its value, and yet it just keeps getting more and more popular. You know, I think the big like standout example this generation is Pokemon. You know, because this is, I think, the most coordinated attack on the franchise I've ever seen. Right, you know, we defeated the Gen 1ers, and we were like, you know, we had this glory age of like Pokemon Go, and what happens? You know, immediately after that, people started complaining about the graphics and like, you know, how these games look and play, and how they should look way better because they're on console now. Completely like misrepresenting what the franchise actually is, misrepresenting its quality, trying to say it's inferior to other Nintendo games. Like, you know, they came out really hard against Pokemon this generation. And what happens? You know, they break records not only with like Switch sales, but also with like, you know, an increase in popularity of like the trading card game and merchandise, right? Pokemon is bigger than ever after one of the most like coordinated shill campaigns ever. You know, people who've hated Pokemon for decades did everything they possibly could to downplay those games, and they completely and utterly failed, to the point where like the narrative has like completely collapsed. You know, like I'll give you an example. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, you know, hated by the online gaming community. You know, everyone says these games are awful, that they're unplayable, that they look like trash, that they don't run well. None of which was true, mind you. But now these games are getting updated on Nintendo Switch, too. So these games get a confirmed update on the new Nintendo console, and suddenly all these fake problems that people said they had with these games are just fixed. You know, Legend ZA, you know, so many people came out and tried to say the game looked bad. You know, we've seen Switch 2 footage now. Looks gorgeous. You know, I actually saw Angry Joe live. Like, ZA came on, and he's just kind of sitting there. He's just like, like he like wants to say it, he wants to admit it, but he can't bring himself to do it. He wants to say the game looks good. Like, saying that about Pokemon would be a death sentence for someone like him. You know, someone who spent like the past 8 years ignoring everything Nintendo puts out while hyping up like absolute garbage, bottom of the barrel trash like Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring, right? You know, acknowledging that Pokemon looks good would have completely dismantled everything the community has tried to build up over the past 8 years. You know, like Beat 'em Ups just put out a video trying to trash the way Pokemon looks. And now with these updates, like, it's just done. You know, it's over. And I think we're reaching the point where the same could be said for Nintendo consoles as a whole. right? Because we've been told for years that these consoles are inferior, that they're not competitive, that like people only buy them because of like Nintendo games and not because the hardware itself is all that great. You know, they've been coping and seething about this for years, but like with the way things look now, the Switch 2 very well may be the first time that people begin to understand that Nintendo consoles are not just the PlayStation and Xbox's equal, they're far superior. And this has been true forever. Like, there isn't a single Nintendo console that's worse than its competition. But, like, you know, the Switch 2 is so far beyond what other consoles are offering. Like, I find it very difficult to believe that the community is going to be able to, like, continue obscuring that fact. You know, the example I'm going to at this stage is Donkey Kong Bonanza versus Astrobot. You know, like Astrobot was worshipped by the community, but Donkey Kong is going to be way more successful and popular long term. To the point where, like, even though Astrobot won a bazillion game awards and was shilled by, like, Jeff Keighley personally, like, Donkey Kong is the one that's going to be the cult classic. You know, it's very possible, the all-time classic, excuse me. Like, it's very possible that, like, this Donkey Kong versus Astrobot is going to be the linchpin towards, like, denouncing the Game Awards as a concept. Because, like, why exactly does Donkey Kong coming out, like, 6 months later on a different console discredit it from competing against Astrobot, right? Just because it came out the year before? You know, like, it's just not on the same level as what Nintendo does with their 3D platformers. And again, that's something we should be talking about. That's something we should be acknowledging. But instead, we're just kind of sitting here going like, well, like, my graphics, like, it's just a gigantic cope, honestly. And I've been saying this for a while now, but like, we're seeing like the death of the traditional gaming community. You know, the people who have been trained since the 90s to religiously hate Nintendo and everything they do, like, they're old now. You know, they're busted. You know, they're completely out of it and have no idea, like, what's actually out there and what people are actually looking forward to. Like, people like Angry Joe are a relic of a bygone age, to the point where, like, I don't even know why anybody even watches his content anymore. You know, like, it's one of those things, like, we are seeing a major cultural shift in the gaming community, and I think it's becoming more and more obvious that the people who hate Nintendo are being left in the dust.